Peace. Welcome to DSW Speaks, a space where clinical theory and practice collide. I'm Dr. Kirk J. James, and this podcast is an extension of our shared commitment to anti-oppressive social work, grounded praxis, and collective liberation. Welcome to DSW Speaks. Do you mind introducing yourself for our audience?
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I am Dr. Abigail Nathanson. I'm very glad to be here, a palliative social worker.
Thank you so much. I always start with this question, right? Because our students, folks that are interested in DSW, it's always a why. Why a DSW? Especially after the MSW, especially after working in the field for so long. Why a DSW?
That's a really good question. There are a lot of options out there for getting advanced training. For me, I had been in the field for about 12 years, and I had really appreciated that I was in a position where I was lucky enough. I had opportunities to write and to be part of research and to be in leadership positions, but I never had training on how to do these things. They were just like, oh, you're smart and good at your job, just go do it. And I really had an appreciation for wanting to be more intentional, I guess, about what kind of leader I was going to be and what kind of programs I was going to develop. Even teaching classes, how I was going to teach a class. And the DSW just seemed like a really good mix of being in a group of colleagues who are all doing the work. They're in the front lines, they're in the fields, they're building out the programs, they're mentoring the next generation, and they're wanting to level up. And I like the idea of both a program that was geared towards the goals that I had of being more accomplished in my field and doing the work, and being around colleagues who are also just doing really neat things. For me, I knew that I was not going to be a researcher. It's not where my skill set is. I wanted to know how to do it. I'm not going to be a researcher, but I still wanted the opportunity to develop and grow. And the DSW for me was the perfect choice.
I love it. Thank you. Great answer. I often hear people talk about imposter syndrome. Was there any imposter syndrome for you in applying to the DSW program?
It's funny, I remember when I was maybe 5 or 6 years out of school, somebody sent me an article that said everyone has imposter syndrome except for you. Like you're the only real fraud.
Yeah.
I think a lot of my colleagues struggled with this idea that I'm not a doctor. Doctors are other people. Doctors are people who are good at these kinds of things or those kinds of things. And I think, for me, it was really important. I was lucky enough to have a lot of people who had doctorates who I saw myself in, who were mentors to me, who I said, I see the ways that I am like you and could be like you. And they took the time over the years to show me how to come up in the world. And so for me, the path was a little bit clearer. And I think for my colleagues who didn't have doctoral level mentors in the field, they just had to take this leap right into nothing and just say, well, I know I'm smart. I know I have more to give. Where do I go with that? And I think that's one of the reasons why this visibility of these doctoral programs are so important.
Love it. Tell us a little bit about your scholarship within the DSW program.
Sure. I'm a palliative social worker. I've worked in hospitals, hospices, caregiving programs, nursing homes, all sorts of places. And when I went from working in hospitals to working in hospice, I had originally made that transition not really recognizing what I was signing up for. I was like, oh, hospice, this might be interesting. It's fewer beds. It might be easier. And I was completely unprepared for the enormity of the work and what it meant. And I got so overwhelmed by the massive amounts of death and suffering that was around me and feeling unprepared for how to deal with it. And in that process of trying to figure out how to find my voice and find my way, I started getting more involved in interns, supervising the interns and saying, well, if I'm underprepared, what are we making these interns do? I got involved in the intern program. I started teaching. I started doing all these different things. And I realized there's so much I could learn about how we set up programs to support clinicians who are doing this really difficult work. And so my interest in the doctoral program was really about my interest in how do you build a program and how do you lead a program and how do you create infrastructure that supports the clinical aspects of doing the work, not just the best thing for the clients or the best thing for the system, but what does it mean to hold emotional space when you're faced with so much suffering all the time? And so my interest in going to the doctoral program really came out of getting super burned out doing the work, having enough support around me to help me find it, getting involved with students, getting involved in teaching, and realizing I wanted to do more. And so my doctoral work was about clinician death anxiety. What are the different ways that providers in their empathy and their empathic stance working with people who are dying how do you sustain that work? How do you sustain the emotional availability, right? Self-care is not just being nice to yourself, it's an entire system. And so my scholarship has really been about this intersection of trauma and grief, right? There's the grief world who gets trauma wrong and the trauma world that gets grief wrong. And my interest has been at this intersection. And so I have advanced training in grief, advanced training in trauma, and I do writing and I do book chapters and I wrote a book and I do trainings and I developed a whole training program here at NYU around grief and trauma. And it's really about how do we help these two siloed fields come together to really be helpful to patients, families, but also the providers themselves. And so my scholarship came out of really hitting a lot of walls professionally and not knowing where to go, but also just seeing a lot of opportunity to create a conversation in spaces where it hadn't really been enough of a conversation before.
Your answer was like almost a perfect DSW student, right? Like I'm always thinking of the perfect DSW student is the one who has this practice experience and they're able to see the gap.
Yeah.
And they come into the program wanting to address that gap. So, your answer was just like, I was like, yes, it's so beautiful.
That's why I'm here.
You are the DSW student, right? That is beautiful. I love it. Your work, though, I love what you're saying as someone who, does a lot of trauma work, understands the impact of trauma, whether vicariously within the profession. How were you able to, I think of often telling DSW students that we are the instruments of our liberation. So, we have to be taking care of ourselves, which are always just like, it's the scariest thing to say to a DSW student. How are you able to hold such a heavy scholarship and also take care of yourself while in the program?
That's a good question. I consider myself very lucky that I have patients who I see for one-to-one work. I do trainings and consultations and program development things, and I do teaching and writing. And so for me, part of my care is being able to engage in the work in different ways. And so some of it is direct practice, some of it is thinking about the work, some of it is teaching the work. And having the different ways of approaching and engaging the work is one of the ways that keeps me feeling powerful and effective. But a lot of this really comes down to what is my why? I think so often we make self-care the burden and responsibility of the person rather than it's really a systems issue, right? Societal issue and a systems issue. What does it mean to recognize that I deserve rest, right? Is so many therapy sessions by itself. But I think for me, the more I know what is my why do I do this work? What is important to me about it? In a world where I can't save people from death, I can't save people from these terrible things they're going through. And I still need to know that I'm powerful and effective, recognizing that they're going to be in distress anyway. And so the more I can ground myself in my why, this idea of, in my trauma therapy modality in AEDP, they talk about undoing aloneness. And that's very powerful for me. And so what am I doing that's helping students feel less alone, helping providers feel less alone, helping patients feel less alone? What can I do in the realm of my work? And the more I can ground myself in my efficacy and my purpose, the more I know what I'm doing. And I'm not waiting for somebody else to validate me. I'm not waiting for somebody else to pay me enough so that I feel valid. I'm not waiting for somebody else to give me a break or recognize my work because I know why I'm doing it.
Yeah.
And so this is the same thing I tell my patients, like, what is your why? What does a recognizable you look like in these circumstances? And I try to keep coming back to that.
I love that. There's such a parallel process. I often reflect that to myself. Like if I don't see myself as valuing of care, of valuing of community, how am I going to really truly advocate for that outside?
Exactly.
Right. So just that accountability is so powerful. Can you share maybe one project, one initiative post your DSW that you are just like really proud of?
Can I share two?
Absolutely. Maybe even three if you'd want.
I get so excited about the work. I would say there's two things that are really like what I would have thought would be bucket list things, things that I would have thought would have taken me another 20 years of professional accomplishment to do that I was able to do in the last couple of years. I'm 5 years out now. And one of them is I edited a textbook. And it was basically an opportunity for my colleague and I to write the work the way we thought it should be done. We had been in the field for 10 or 20 years. This wasn't being written by academics who hadn't touched a patient in 20 years. We knew the people who were not generally getting published, but who knew the work really well, people on the front lines doing the work, and it's not the same voices over and over. And so we found 28 social workers from across the country and people who are still doing the work and in their hands. And we paired people up, people who didn't know each other. We wanted to get out of groupthink. We wanted to get out of people having their own cultural ideas. And we paired up people who didn't know each other, and we assigned them topics in their areas of expertise, and we gave them an outline, and we said, this is how we want to understand the psychosocial impacts of illness, not the medical impacts, not the other things, but the psychosocial impacts. And it became this really cool creative process. And the outcome is this book that I'm so proud of. And like 1 million people are never going to read this book, right? It's a very niche, very small book. But the book represents so much of how I want to think about the work getting done. And the people who have touched it, who have looked at it, and even the people who are writing it, it was so meaningful to do something the way that you know it should be done.
Yeah.
And the way I want it to be done. And I'm just really proud of having given a lot of people a voice who normally wouldn't know how to publish. They wouldn't know how to do that. People had to hold my hands through the first couple of times I wrote, and I shoved a few people through it as well. But voices who I felt like needed to be heard in a way in which it's not normally heard. And so that book is something that I'm very proud of. And I would say the other piece is this actually just finished at NYU with Dr. Piccolino, who's the new head of the Zelda Foster program at NYU. She and Nita Arbiter and I had created this advanced clinical seminars in grief and trauma. I had done a one-time lecture on grief and trauma, and there's a lot of interest in the community. And Dr. Piccolino had said, hey, why don't you come do it in for NYU? And I said, what if instead of just doing me, what if we had like 6 people and we created a whole series around grief and trauma? And she said, great. And so again, I got to go find my colleagues in the field, the people whose voices are not normally heard. They're not academically accomplished people. They are professionally accomplished people. And we created a whole training program. And we have 6 webinars now. They are live and recorded, but they are talking about this intersection of grief and trauma where nobody talks about it. People talk about grief and they talk about trauma. And I had the people coming together to talk about we have a sex therapist coming in talking about what is the intersection of sex and grief and trauma, DBT therapists, we have trauma therapists, we have grief researchers, all these people coming together. And it was really cool to have enough knowledge about how presentations and teaching and stuff can go to do it, but also have had enough clinical practice to know the people who are doing this cool work in the field. And it's just so powerful that, again, it's like, this is the stuff I wish I had had 20 years ago. And it's really cool to feel like I get to influence how the work gets taught and how people take it in and create this space for it, right? And so much of my doctoral training was about how to think about learning and how to think about teaching and how to think about information and how to be a thought leader in your own field. And it's been really cool to be able to run with that and to have had the mentors to help me run with it. But those are the 2 things I would say that give me the most warm and fuzzies for my doctoral program.
Warm and fuzzies. But I mean, both of them are so incredible because I often think about, people closest to problem or closest to solution, but furthest from the resources. Mm-hmm. So in both cases, you really center in marginalized voices, mm-hmm. which I believe is such a powerful tool of change. So thank you. Mm-hmm. You kind of spoke to that a little bit, of kind of maybe learning a lot of things on the fly. What does it mean for you to be a part of the DSW alumni network? How are you leveraging your community? I know you're still involved with a lot of people, your cohort, things like that. Tell us a little bit about that.
There's a very special kind of person who's drawn to a DSW, right? Yeah. It's not interchangeable with a PhD. A PhD, you want one kind of job and career and direction, and the DSW, you want another one. And so to be in community with people who want to have one foot in practice and one foot in like, how do you better the practice at the same time? It's very inspiring, right? There's all these people, like my world is so insular, right? Like in palliative social work, I know most of us, it's not a big world. And in my cohort, it's, I had experts in child abuse and substance recovery and mental health things and just all these different fields that I would normally just never really get to learn and grow about. And you see these people who are thought leaders in their own fields, and we're all sort of coming together and then everything else. And so every time I've met people through the doctoral program, there's been that similar sensibility of being excited to do the work and excited to think about the work, sort of in equal measure. Yeah. And so being part of that kind of community, it's really inspiring, and it's getting me to think about social work in a bigger way. After 20 years, my world got a little more narrow, and I feel like the DSW program, I just met people who broadened it back up again.
I love that. Thank you. Sure. What would you give? I mean, DSW programs are the fastest growing mm-hmm. Program right now in social work, right? What advice would you give to yourself coming into your DSW program now? What advice would you give to someone else at this point in history, right, in 2025, that is considered a DSW?
It will be harder than you think. It will be more doable than you think. And I would say be proactive about your own learning. No program is a one size fits all for everybody. Nobody's going to get every single thing they want out of every program, but there are people who care deeply about the work involved in the program. And if you take the time to form relationships with people, to ask your favorite professors, who else should I be talking to? Who else is in the field? Who else should I be connected with? Take some responsibility to take advantage of the people who want to help you learn and want to help you grow. Some of your learning will happen in the classroom, some of it will happen with your cohort, some of it will happen when you're locked up in the library writing papers, and a lot of it will happen when you go out there and you meet people and you put yourself out there to do new things. And so let it be harder than you think, but also have faith that you can do a lot. You're going to surprise yourself. You can do a lot more than you thought you could.
I love that. Last question. Or maybe not last question, maybe second to last, right? Let's see. But where do you see the field of social work? What's your, if you had powers to kind of create, right? Like, I love the imagination question.
Yeah.
And your work is also, as you said, like, I remember whether it be a student or a professor, like, no one wants to do palliative care social work, right? And they should, because but they should, right? But I remember, just everyone is afraid of death and dying. It's the taboo in a world where we're all going to die, right? And yet no one wants to talk about it. Where do you see the field going? What wisdom would you share? What would something that, and it doesn't have to be palliative care. It could be, you do so much work, right? But what's something that you wish you would see the field like doing more of or evolving towards?
With the advent of AI, I think there's so much that's going to be changing in our field. I had a patient who ended up using AI instead of therapy. She quit therapy because she felt like AI, she was asked ChatGPT all of her questions, she liked the answers, and she felt like that was enough for her. My hope, and it's not, my hope is that social work finds a way to recognize the value we bring in the intersubjective space, in the human space, that even as AI makes our work better and makes our work worse in all the ways in which it will, that we find ways to capitalize on the value of the human connection, of what it means to be a human being sitting across from a human being, to have two nervous systems co-regulating, to have somebody taking in the enormity of who you are as a person and what it means to create safety. And I think we're going to have to learn as a community, as a social work community, how much value that brings. And we're going to have to be able to stand up for ourselves and say, hey, this is a value that we are bringing, and the way that we use our minds and the way that we use our emotions and our souls are going to be part of the healing process. And so my hope is that we lean into the power of that more.
That's so beautiful, and very connected to that, parallel process that you talk about, right? Like the responsibility for us to show up and do our own trauma work, to do our own healing, to do our own introspection. It was so beautiful. Any last words that you want to share with, whether it's our community, whether it's, someone watching this video right now?
I hope that everybody finds a way to take up more space in the world, whatever that means to you, and whatever the barriers are to you believing that you don't get to take up space, that you don't have enough credibility or expertise or privilege to take up space, that your lived experience has no value. Whatever those barriers are that are mutable, I hope that people find a way to take up space. And the DSW is one way to help you take up space, to say that who I am and what I've been through and how I think about things has value in the world, and I can show it to the world. And I would say if you feel like you're ready for that challenge, the DSW is a great way to go.
Bam. Thank you. I appreciate having you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. You were